Stunning testimony from two former top officials of the Donald Trump Justice Department talking about the role that the president, a member of Congress, and a Justice Department official named Jeffrey Clark played in trying to concoct a scheme to steal the election from the American people. The testimony came, I think it's worth pointing out, from the acting Attorney General, Jeffrey Rosen, and the acting Deputy Attorney General, Richard Donoghue, both of them former, of course, who were individuals who were allegiant to Donald Trump. These were top Trump officials, top Trump Justice Department officials, and yet their allegiance to the Constitution and to the facts of what happened in the 2020 election overrode that loyalty to President Trump. They did not criticize Donald Trump at all personally, Dana Bash. They did not say anything negative about him. They just described his behavior. I don't know that any of the people who believe these election lies are watching or listening, but it really was quite jarring testimony.
It was, and the way that they described, especially Richard Donoghue, described the back and forth that he had, he called it a serial fashion. He said that he corrected the then president in a serial fashion. When Donald Trump would say allegation X, he would push back with facts that he had the Justice Department look into. Allegation Y, same thing. And he would go on and on and on to the point where Donoghue said, Mr. President, he said he wanted to cut through the noise. He was very intentional, knowing that the president was, his brain was being filled with these conspiracies. Clearly, he was looking for the conspiracies. He could not get through to him.
The other thing that was very compelling is how they push back on Jeffrey Clark in no uncertain terms. Hirschman saying, congratulations, you just admitted your first step or act you would take as Attorney General would be committing a felony. Talked about how they were clobbering him over the head. You're an environmental lawyer. How about you go back to your office and we'll call you when there's an oil spill, over and over and over again. And yet Donald Trump wanted to put this man at the top of DOJ just to overturn the election.
I thought it was very notable that they made it very clear there was no reason for Trump to have known who Jeffrey Clark was. There was no business before the White House that Clark would have been authorized to talk to Trump about. They were confused as to why Jeffrey Clark's name even came out of Trump's mouth on the very first day that the acting Attorney General, Jeffrey Rosen, took on his job. And Trump called him on the phone, as he did apparently every day for quite some time in the period of December and January, and mentioned Jeff Clark. So this is someone who came more or less out of obscurity, but we got some important hints as to how Jeff Clark was injected into the bloodstream of this conspiracy. Members of Congress meeting with Trump at the White House in late December. The next day after that meeting, Scott Perry, the congressman who is allegedly sought a pardon, shows up back at the White House and brings Jeffrey Clark back in tow. He was there for the only purpose to basically say that there was corruption that happened, allowing the partisans, the corrupt partisans, by the way, to carry out an effort to overturn the results of the election in multiple states across the country with no evidence.
It's just stunning that Mr. Clark repeatedly ignored his superiors telling him to stop, back down. This is not your place, because Mr. Clark clearly thought he was working for the President of the United States. And they're leading us down a path, the resource now, to get more into the role of Mark Meadows and Congressman Perry as this plays out, essentially that they had a shell operation trying to work around the positions of power. And Trump land always smears people who come out to say these things. I just want to remind you, the day they were appointed Deputy Attorney General Jeff Rosen, an outstanding person, that's Donald J. Trump, an outstanding person will become Acting Attorney General. Highly respected Richard Donoghue will be taking over the duties of Deputy Attorney General. Thank you all.
Yeah, and Anderson, one of the things that's really so shocking about this is that I think it was former Acting Deputy Attorney General Richard Donoghue telling Jeffrey Clark, telling this freelancing would-be Attorney General that he was meddling in election, that he was committing crimes, that he was breaking the law, and Clark kept doing it, Anderson.
And Donahue himself being told by the president on a late night phone call, just say it was corrupt and leave the rest to me and the Republican congressman. I want to bring in CNN's Evan Perez. Evan, we just heard from 3 of these former top DOJ officials. I'm wondering what stood out to you, what your big takeaways are.
You know, one of the things, Anderson, that hangs over all of this is whether these men ever heard Donald Trump tell them or order them to break the law, to do something illegal. And I think, you know, what I'm told is neither of these men believe that Trump ever ordered them to break the law. And that's an important thing. That's an important conclusion, at least, from or assessment from these men who are very important witnesses to a key part of this attempt by the former president to overturn the election. At least in their view is that he was getting bad advice from people like Rudy Giuliani, from people like John Eastman, others who were essentially pushing forward the idea that, you know, he could find some legal way, some way to overturn the results of the election, and in that way keep himself in power. And that's the way they view this. And so one of the interesting things, you know, I'm listening to this testimony is whether anyone asks that question of them. I don't know if anyone will, but that's where these men are.
Yeah.